couple steps I have to
there
go
it is.
through. Okay, you're live.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, late afternoon. We have a number of guests, and we have, I'm not doing the math to see if we have a quorum of the meeting, but by quick observation, it looks like we do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So yeah, we had 8 members. We certainly have a quorum to do our business. We will postpone doing minutes, and we don't have any old business. But otherwise, is everyone okay? Approve the agenda for today? Okay, I think so. Nodding ahead works. Thank you. So let's jump right into it. And Honorable Jarrasco, if you'd like to introduce yourself. I did only share your information, your memo last night. So everyone has not had a thorough amount of time to review it carefully. I aspire to do better than that in general. So that normally we can assume everyone's read everything in advance, but I don't know that we can make that assumption today.
Thank you, Chairman Whitman. I'm Ron Jarrasco. I'm a former judge on the Circuit Court for Anne Arundel County. I returned to law practice in 2011. I've had over 40 years of law practice now. I'm kind of senior. I was chair after I got off the bench of the Ward Redistricting Commission in 2011 after the last census. And I think the report that we rendered as the committee has been circulated or is certainly available from Hillary if you haven't seen it already. In that report, we had a bipartisan, balanced commission from all over the city, as I think the current commission is, and we undertook to redistrict the city. And in that regard, I set out and I researched at that time, and you'll see in the first couple of pages of the report and in the memo that I sent off to the committee just a short time ago last week, I reviewed what the legal foundation is for the standards for redistricting. And my memo to you as the commission is far more extensive than what is actually in the report. The report just has 2 pages as summary, but I really tried to do a substantial recitation of what the legal foundation is for redistricting in the state of Maryland. And as I discovered back in 2011, the Maryland standard is somewhat different from the federal standard, and it helps explain why we get the federal map we do in Maryland compared to what we can do in the state. The Maryland law permits up to 5% of variation from district to district. Some of the authorities suggest it can be higher, but at least judicially, there have been court opinions approving a 5% variation. And that gives us more flexibility in complying with the other standards which we tried to follow in the last commission. In contrast, on the state level, my understanding is it has to be under 1%. And so you end up with having to really adjust your districts on a federal level to meet that standard. And the whole basic premise of any redistricting is one person, one vote. And one of the recent cases talked about is that the voting population or all the population, and a case that I've cited in my memo to you all talks about, it's all the population. So it's not just the voters that you're counting. And that's one of the principles. I don't want to spend too long because you have plenty of other work to do, but in the last pages of my memo to your commission, I summarized the factors that come from all the cases as best I could. And the goal, as I just said, is to accomplish one person, one vote based on population. So you're supposed to have substantially equal population among the districts. There are preferences that have been stated in cases for doing that process. So you're supposed to try to keep adjoining territory contiguous. So the areas of the city that are touching or adjoining each other, you want to not have them separated by distance. And you are supposed to try to keep the district as compact as possible. You're supposed to have, of course, substantially equal population, which I just said, and you're supposed to try to follow natural boundaries, streams, major streets, other kinds of factors like that. You're supposed to try to form your districts around those kinds of natural boundaries. And you're also supposed to, on a more federal level, have to provide by the political subdivisions. I don't think that really applies in Annapolis because unlike if you're doing the whole state where you want to keep the city of Annapolis together or Greenbelt together or something like that, within the city, you might talk about communities in that regard. So that's a decision you'll have to make. You're supposed to protect communities of interest. That's not defined anywhere, but that means really, I think, if you have like Admiral Heights or Germantown Homewood or, other areas of the city that you want to protect that have communities of interest, you would try to honor those as best you can. And you're supposed to try to keep communities intact. And this all comes from the summary I put in the last couple of pages of my memo. You're also supposed to look at what the status quo is. So you look at what are the current boundaries. Well, that's kind of a starting point anyway. You're not starting on a blank slate. You're starting with what the city has now and deciding can you adjust and still comply with these guidelines. Again, up to the 5% variation. And then there's something that's been defined on this federal level called the Jingles factors test, which comes from a Supreme Court case. And that is based on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so you're supposed to try to evaluate whether you're making districts that somehow dilute or undermine minority voting rights. And if you get me, you're supposed to try not to do that. You cannot deny or abridge the minority population voting rights. The case says, and the guideline says, that you look at the totality of the circumstances. What that is going to vary with what you take into consideration. And it's really the test of whether the minority citizens have less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. Obviously, on a federal level, that's a very significant factor. And even in the city of Annapolis, it has to be respected. And then I just referenced that I have earlier in the memo all the factors that this 2012 legislative districting case decided that you should take into consideration. I didn't repeat them in the summary, but you can go up earlier in the memo and look at all those factors. So with that, that's all I wanted to present. So you have a foundation on a legal basis of what we took into consideration when we did it in 2011, and I think is a guideline for you to consider as you go through your process. I'm happy to answer any questions. And as you have your meeting, as I told Hillary at the beginning of the meeting, I'll probably exit and go home. But if you want me to come back in, send me an email and I'd be happy to join back on from home and answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I have 3 questions, but before I ask mine, I'd like to open it up to the other task force members to ask their questions. Seeing none, I'll ask mine. The memo from 2011 includes a reference to a dissent opinion that said up to 10% deviation from the average would have a presumption of accuracy. What should we use? The 5% that you mentioned, or is that 10% something that's reliable?
So the case that I was referring to, and it's in the memo that I sent, they did talk about considering up to 10% variation from district to district. But that case approved a 5% variation as being acceptable. So you have a gray area. Would the court, or if challenged by anyone, say, oh yeah, well, over 5% is okay? Or would they say, you know what, that case said 5% was okay, and even though we talked about the potential that up to 10% of variation is acceptable, we've never considered that before. So it would be a case of first impression for a court. I think you're more on safer footing to say no more than a 5% variation. Now, if you ended up with 6% in one district, maybe that's still acceptable if you have a strong rationale based upon the other factors.
I imagine it would be somewhat skewed, or at least factored away, whether it was you were accepting an existing imbalance of 6-7% versus you created a ward, and by your action it had a 6 or 7 or 8-10% imbalance.
I think that's true, and I think that probably we tried to achieve no more than a 5% variation when we did it 11 years ago or 10 years ago. But of course, people move around. The population has changed. So you're going to have to look at the new factors. And Sean Wampler, who was our guru for the GIS, did a great job for us in looking at the maps. And we talked about moving things around. You could do it in real time. And it made it very efficient and easy for us with that guidance.
Great. We're very fortunate to have Mr. Lyles join us, the current city attorney. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Lyles. I saw you had your hand up, and looked like you might have some input on that question.
Yeah, just to give some other context to that, and we appreciate the judge for all the work he's done so far, and everything is right on point. I would say, though, when you look at your population increase, and I was just kind of looking at that, if you haven't increased more than 5% in Annapolis, I do not think it has, or 10%, you're really not talking about adjusting that much, because your population hasn't even increased 10% in the 10 years. So that would be a starting point. Have we increased 30% or 10% such that a 10% adjustment might be in the realm of possibility? I think our increase has been less than that. So you're probably not up to a lot of 10% variations any way you look at it.
I'll just add this, that of course, I was the chair of the comprehensive plan in 2009, and I know that we designed parts of the city to grow. And therefore, it wouldn't surprise me if population is shifted from one ward to another.
But that also presumes that the committee or task force, I have to get used to calling the task force, doesn't make any wild swings. Like if we wanted to, I saw in the last 10 years ago, there was discussion of moving things around so you'd have public housing in all 8 wards. I'm not suggesting we consider that, but the point about not having big population changes assumes that we're not making any substantial changes and we're only fine tuning it. The second
just
question
so you
I had
know,
is,
the population, according to the most recent demographic information, has increased about 2.21%. So you're way under, you probably will be in 5% category and won't even get to the 10% based on the current change. Again, you may find that people are moving around in the city, but it's probably not going to be anywhere near 10% of the population, 3,000 or 4,000 people moving from one district to another. Probably not happened.
Makes sense. I assume we're bound, but I don't like to make assumptions. I assume we're bound by 8 wards, right? We can't do anything crazy about dividing up the city differently.
You're bound by 8 wards. Now, you can do something else, but that would, of course, require a charter change, right? So you could recommend to the city council a charter change. For instance, the population is now 50,000, for instance, and we recommend 9 wards of about 8,000-9,000 people apiece.
And then the last question I have is, it sounded like the guidance was in general to base the population distribution based on actual population. Is it an option, just so I know what the options are, to base it instead on what the eligible voter population is?
I believe not. There's it's like a 2012 case that I discuss in my memo, in which that was the precise question. Is redistricting based on population or just the voting population? And the court concluded it's based on population. I believe that's what we used in 2011 as population. So we were consistent with what the later court ruling was. But based on that Court of Appeals ruling, I think you are bound to look at just population.
And I will second that by saying voting population, of which our voting population can be skewed, right? Someone could be a voting age, but not registered. Mm-hmm. Someone could be voting age, but otherwise prohibited from voting. So how would you even get to the voting population would be very scary. Plus, the census records heads, bodies, right? Not respecting voting privileges.
All good points. Just wanted to know the parameters so we don't go off on any wild tangents. I don't have any other further questions on this topic. Does anyone else before we move on? All right. Again, thank you very much, Mr. Jarrasco. Appreciate your
You're welcome,
contributions.
everybody. As I said, I can be available. I'm going to exit, and I'm happy to answer questions either now or at a later date.
Fantastic. We will likely take you up on that.
That's anytime. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Ms. Lyles, again, thank you for joining us. It's certainly nice to be able to work with you on this, and I appreciate your expertise in this area. What else should we know from a legal perspective, and what recommendations, guidance do you have?
Not much. I mean, you have the flexibility to organize and to meet as you will. You will need to establish some parameters for your meetings. Are you meeting once a month? Are you meeting quarterly? And at what point will you come up with some recommendations for the council? Will it be in 6 months or what have you? So you do have to figure those out. Other than that, you're going to run the meeting in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order and hopefully do the research necessary to put in front of the council your recommendations, whatever they may be. And we're just here to help and help you do research and to answer any legal questions that may come up that you have. But we're here to help you.
Great. Thank you. I distributed yesterday to the committee for our review today the rest of the schedule. And in that schedule, I'm just trying to pull it up. Here it is. Which the committee will get to later, but to the extent that it involves the law office, we are essentially meeting monthly. I believe from the originating resolution, we have 6 months to conclude our business. I added in a 1 month with 2 meetings so that we have time to have 2 public hearings, one at our next meeting and one once we have something to propose. This agenda has on Tuesday, March 15th, the commission, I got to change it to task force voting on proposed plans. Once that occurs, Mr. Lyle, we'll then be turning it, assuming we are successful in reaching a final vote on the map, we'll be turning that over to you or your office so that we can have the legislation drafted. And I saw the legislation from the last time. It's obviously very tedious legislation where you got to turn right here, go a block, turn left, and so on. So that's the time frame of when you can expect a proposal by us if things go as I have this in this draft, which again, we have not approved as a task force yet, with getting those results back in time from you to vote on the final legislation on Tuesday, April 19th, roughly a month later. So if you would please make a note of that, and then I'm sure Hillary will keep you updated if those 2 dates change, but that's as of now what we're looking at, March 15th to give you the map, and April 19th to vote on the legislation that you'll have prepared. The proposed schedule then envisions a work session on April 21st. We're presenting our findings, our work, and then first reader, April 25th, public hearing, May 9th, final vote, June 13th. Hillary has all the details, but I think
I was going to say, I put those dates in just as theoretical timeline to give you all an idea of how it would go through. In the end, the mayor and city attorney set the actual agenda.
Sure.
We'll work with you on that.
Good point.
And if there are needs, if there's a need for any extensions, we can help with that as well.
Thank you. Hillary, did we, just one legal issue, the resolution, there was some question whether the resolution included the Ward 6 member. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, for joining us. I'm glad that you're able to represent Ward 6. Was the resolution complete in adding Mr. Brennan, or do we need the council to go back and do something for that?
I spoke with Mr. Lyles about this a few weeks ago, and he said that he could just be added at this point. So you are, because it is a task force, you are appointed, and here you are.
Great. I did have one question. In 2011, the group was a commission, and we're a task force. Is that of significance in any way? Is there a reason why it was a change? Somebody had thought to change it from commission to task force. What's the reasoning, and what's the importance of that?
There is technically no ward and redistricting commission in the code. So a commission was created without authority. So I'm not really sure how they got the word commission, but it doesn't exist in the code. What does exist is the council shall perform this function and appoint people to help it with that. So rather than go through the formality of a commission and the kinds of advice and consent that has to happen and the time it takes, I mean, we're already behind the time. We figured a task force, or we recommended a task force be formed to perform the function. The council is the one that actually makes the decision, and you're assisting with that.
Okay, so there's nothing of significance that we need to take from that. Our work is essentially the same as their work.
Yes.
Okay. And then just to state what's probably obvious to everybody, but in case there's any doubt, once the work is done and the legislation is adopted, it has no practical effect until the next election, correct?
Not entirely. Yes, practically yes, but anything could affect distribution of services based on wards and other things that the government might do in a ward capacity may be affected by the change. But the election is the main reason why it's done, for voting purposes.
Right, but if, say, Hunt Meadow becomes part of Ward 4.
Yeah, it wouldn't, the average citizen wouldn't care about it until the next election.
Right, our representative is still the Ward 5 alderman until the election. Okay.
Exactly.
Any questions from anyone on the committee of Mr. Lyles? Right. Seeing and hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Lyles. Really appreciate you joining us, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
With questions.
All right.
And I know Hillary will keep you updated.
Yes, indeed. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. We are right on time. Yay, us. We are also fortunate to have two guests from the city of the two liaisons. We have the Hispanic liaison, Laura Gutierrez. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. You're available to, thank you. Please introduce yourself, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on our mission, and let you take it off from there, please.
Great. Hi. I don't know if you guys can hear me. My camera isn't working for some reason. So yes. Okay. So
I can hear you.
Thank you.
We can hear you.
I created a short, hopefully, presentation. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let me know when you can see this. Can you see my screen there? Awesome. Yes. Okay. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you all for having me, for the invitation to present. I'm really excited to follow up on the work of this task force, not commission. I'm really eager to see what happens in our city and with the zones that we've got, the wards that we've got. So just a little bit of background in terms of what I'm seeing here is that we have a changing Annapolis demographic. I think we all have been following the census data, but in the country, in the state, in our city, we have really shown now that the Hispanic Latino community is the fastest growing population, especially when we're looking at our school system and our public school systems, where we have a lot of our schools that are majority Hispanic. Tyler Heights is a prime example of that. It's over 90% Hispanic. And so one of the things that I really hope we do have with this task force is that we ensure that our community's voices are heard, that their needs are addressed and their rights are protected. And I really think that can be advanced significantly with the work of this task force, because if we have conscientious redistricting, then we can really advance change. So when we're looking at our data in Annapolis for the first time in our history, we now have a ward that is majority Hispanic. So that's really exciting, Ward 3. So out of our general population, we have 22.7% of the Annapolis population is Hispanic or Latino. That brings a little triangle with an exclamation point next to it, which means that there's actually been methodological differences in terms of how that data was collected. So that number is probably even higher. I just wanted to highlight here on the bottom right, you'll see the other column. That other column, a lot of Hispanics identify in that group. One is the second gen Latino who was born here as an American citizen and sometimes decides not to identify as Hispanic or Latino. We also have a lot of Hispanic Latinos who come from indigenous descents, and so they identify as Aztec or Mayan, and they don't want to identify as Hispanic Latino. So I just wanted to sort of bring that to attention. And here's the photo of the census with the asterisk here on the top with the 22.7. So other important factors that I hope we can keep in mind when looking at the census numbers is, so not only the asterisk and the other is that there's a fear and mistrust factor also when we look at the numbers in the Hispanic community. A lot of our Latino community doesn't want to answer this. They feel like, they might think that ICE can somehow access census information. So that's one of the barriers we have to face when trying to get our Latino population to fill out the census. Sorry, my child is coming up here. Also that there's people who are unaware of the census at all. They don't know that that's something that they have to be filling out, and others that are really working 2-3 jobs and are not home when censors do arrive at doors and they haven't filled out the census. So that happens a lot within the Hispanic community as well. And then the other factor is how this actually translates into our voting representation. So voter status right now, and I did want to mention that we do have an emerging youth vote in the Hispanic community, as is reflected in our school system. And so one of the things that I think is really important for us to consider is that we can create some intentionality in our representation. So here I'm putting up some photos of our one Hispanic person that was elected to the city council, Mark Rodriguez. And without his representation, we really would not have been able to advance a whole lot of legislation that considers our Hispanic community. Sorry. And so, I just wanted to come up with a couple of the things that he did advance. One of them being the Fair Housing Ordinance, making sure that there's rental agreements regardless of immigration status. That was huge for our Hispanic community. He supported beginning the language access plan for our limited English proficiency neighbors. He extended hours at Pitt Moyer Rec Center so that it would be more accessible for our community, expanding the affordable housing access. And generally, he also supported the city of Annapolis with breaking through language and trust barriers as well. There's a photo here to the right of him actually working the call center so that people who spoke Spanish would have access to city resources and information during emergency situations. So one of the things that we look at when we're talking about our minority communities is voter dilution. So packing or splitting. Packing is unnecessarily concentrating our minority communities in one ward or district, and then splitting is unnecessarily breaking them up. And that can really limit opportunities. So, I think this is sort of straightforward, but we do need a logical racial and ethnic community balance in our wards. We also need to make sure that we have communities that have access to representation, and contemplating our ward lines right now can really keeping this in mind can really help to advance equity in the city. And this is just me saying, generally, if we don't have a city agenda that contemplates part of our community, a city government that has representation within our city council that can help us to pass legislation, then it's really hard to advance the work for our Hispanic community. So it's, and right now, having one of our fastest growing communities as Hispanic, we really need to make sure that we can ensure access, representation, respect for Latinos within Annapolis. And so I talked to a couple of our community members this past week since I found out that we were going to be speaking to you guys. So this is what I was asked to sort of bring up today. So the challenges faced that were mentioned this past week were about the language barriers that we have across the board. Amor, cerras la puerta. The trust, the access to resources, also across the board, access to jobs, migration status, discrimination, overcrowding, and quality of life as challenges that were faced, and that they asked that this commission, this task force, please consider that our employment labor force is the largest growing in the Latino community, that we are representing frontline workers in the economy as Latinos, that non-citizen Latinos also contribute and pay taxes through ITIN numbers and businesses. So it's not just the citizen Latinos, also non-citizen Latinos are contributing. That they represent a high percentage of public school students in Annapolis and over 10% in our county. That they also are non-citizen Latinos also need representation and they participate generally as well. There's a lot of civic engagement from our non-citizen Latinos as well. And that despite being the largest minority group in Annapolis, there's no Hispanic representation on the council. And this is something that can also be supported with when looking at our redistricting in wards. So when considering Latino voices, I kind of think in terms of, just to sum it up, what was being said was that supporting wards can lean towards a minority majority for both our Black and our Brown communities to be able to have a representation in our city council, and that creating participation in this process is vital. So I hope, I know you guys mentioned just now that there's going to be 2 public hearings. I'd be happy to support in terms of connecting more Latinos to joining this process. It can really empower our community and motivate them for further civic engagement. So thank you. Here's my info in case you guys want to connect. I'm happy to also support in any way needed. And any questions?
Thank you very much. Do you have a few minutes for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Lloyd has had his Zoom chat hand up. So Mr. Lloyd, would you like to unmute and ask a question, please?
Actually, my question was from earlier because I never received. Did we get an email for the summary from the judge?
We did. I sent it to everybody yesterday. It was about 10 p.m. last night. I apologize for it getting so late, but you didn't get it?
I didn't get it.
Okay. And I have your email as c-lloyd@live.com.
Yes.
We're on a public meeting right now, so
Oh.
I'll email it to you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Jared, I have
Speaking of which, hold on one second. Mr. Brennan had, or I think we can use first names, right? Greg had a question.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, I have a concern about using total population versus voting population for segmentation, because the one population in our city that might have the biggest disparity between total and voting would be the Hispanic community. And would that make a neighborhood get carved off or marginalized? I don't know if it's a trivial amount or whether that's I just think it's something we have to keep in mind.
So just to make sure I heard you correctly, the first question was using the voting eligibility versus the actual the person population, and we certainly got clarity that we need to use the person population and not take into account voting population. But I think your larger point is that not everyone in that community votes, maybe to a lesser proportion, and that's something we should consider.
Well, if there's a Hispanic neighborhood that has a large component of non-voting members, it might look too big and we might carve it up, even though when we look at the voting population, it's not really a change.
Right. Ms. Gutierrez, do you have any response to that?
Well, I think those are important concerns, and I would urge that we consider not splitting our communities when we're looking at what we have right now. And you know, in the breakup that we have right now, I don't really see how packing in these in what we have right now could even be possible. So I do urge trying to connect our Latino communities to create more fair representation and the ability to have access in the city council. Like I mentioned, we only have had one Hispanic council member, and we haven't been able to sustain that. So that would be something that we should try to be able to continue having.
Just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, I think I am. You prefer a concentration, so maybe a redrawing of the lines where we could concentrate the number of Hispanics in a single ward as opposed to having some Hispanics in many wards. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, I wouldn't say in a single ward. I would say focusing on a couple of wards is good. Versus there's wards we know that are gonna, you know, the representation right there is going to be much lower no matter what. And I think what we have right now, for example, Ward 6, Ward 3, Ward 5, there's some possibility for change and for bringing more Latinos into those numbers and actually creating higher representation. But I wouldn't take away from all of the, you know, I wouldn't go to a zero number, or I wouldn't try to dilute in that level. I do think we need to have representation in every ward. I just think that there's the ability to maneuver it a little bit.
Gutierrez, I have two brief requests, and then Marianne has a question. The two requests are: one, the deck that we just saw, can you please forward that by email to Hillary so she can share it with the rest of us, and so we have your information?
Absolutely.
This might be a little vain, but because Mark was actually my intern for Ward 5, and then we worked on a few things together, that first thing you had on the list about the non-discrimination, that was actually my legislation. So I'm not ready to give up that credit.
That's why
to,
I was actually
to Mark for that.
I actually was gonna mention that, but then I just skipped over it. But I knew that he worked on it, not that he actually passed it. But because he was a part of the work. With you.
I appreciate that. I know I'm being a little vain. I guess I can't help it. But yeah, so if you can, the second request is, would you be willing to sit with me when I meet with Ms. Wampler? And I'd like to have your input on and knowledge on where the different concentrations of Hispanics live. And so maybe we could play around with the maps and see what there is to be, what we could come up with. Would you mind meeting
Absolutely.
with me and Ms. Wampler?
Yes, I would love
I'll
that.
follow up with you on that offline. Thank you. Marianne, you had a question?
Yes, my experience, I work at Tyler Heights, and it has approximately 93 to 96% Hispanic families. And my experience over the years is that given the opportunity, the parents are very, very involved. And I guess my comment more than anything else as we go forward, and especially as we get closer to the public hearings, I think we should make every effort to reach out and include families who are not English speakers in the process. And one of the ways that we can do that is providing interpreter services, and also providing notices in Spanish, and almost even mini meetings to let them know what this process is. So number one, Laura, I would be very happy to work with you as a representative of this task force, if that's appropriate, to look at how we can provide the access to our Hispanic communities. I know that there is very strong feelings about public safety, about representation, about transportation, job opportunities. And I think that this is something that we really have a responsibility to do for our Hispanic and citizens, or even non-inhabitants, because a lot of our families are not citizens, but they still live here. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, that would be great. I will share that there's two ways that we could easily collaborate. One is that we have created a texting platform to share communications with our Latino community. So when we did a survey at the beginning of the pandemic, we basically asked what's the best way of communicating with our Hispanic community, and the response was overwhelmingly via text. So we now have a texting platform where we reach out to a lot of our community members in the city, and it's been working really well. And there's a two-way communications channel, so they can text back, we can have conversations, they can call us, and it will call directly to our cell phone line that's only in Spanish. So we can definitely use that platform to share this information. And also we do a weekly Facebook Live. It reaches around 600 people each in Spanish each week. So we could try to bring that information in every week, or have one day with one or more of you guys sharing information about what redistricting is, or I'm happy to do that as well. Those are just two ways that I can think of right now that would be great ways to get the information out. And I would share also about Tyler Heights, and since you brought it up, and how parents are so involved. So one of the things that when we think about Hispanic representation in the city council, since we haven't had that, one of the things that Mark had been pushing was actually getting a city ID, right? So that our parents could be able to pick up their kids from school, sometimes because they didn't have access to an ID because they had recently arrived. Sometimes ICE retains documentation as soon as they cross the border. So a lot of people don't have access to IDs, and they can't pick up their children even from school. So, having this idea of a city ID was something that he was pushing in that moment, and that has been lost since then, right? So that's also another motivator for representation on the council.
Thank you. I'll be in touch with you. I think that there's some really important issues here that we can talk about aside from just redistricting.
Great.
Excellent discussion. Thank you. Anyone else from the task force have any questions from Ms. Gutierrez? All right. Thank you, Ms. Gutierrez, very much for your time. And again, thank you for sharing that deck with Hillary, and I'll be in touch as well. And it sounds like you'll be hearing from Marianne.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next guest is our African American liaison. Mr. Help me with your last name. Ajay?
Ajayi.
Ajayi. Sorry, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The floor is yours to share with us what we'd like.
Okay. So thank y'all for inviting me. I haven't done a lot of research, but I've just been kind of just doing my own little research about the redistricting. Something that kind of always stuck out to me was Ward 6. And I know you had briefly mentioned earlier, speaking to the attorney, about the thought about spreading the public housing into each ward, so that, in my mind, it would allow, every alder person to, have to, reckon with the public housing communities. But as well, I find that Ward 6 has very few commercial businesses in that ward. And I think that also leads to kind of like an economic disenfranchisement of the people in that ward. I don't know the history of exactly how it came to be, but I believe it was intended to have a predominantly African-American voting bloc. And I think probably at that time, it probably made sense. I just think that because of the change in demographics and really the change of public housing to public-private partnerships, this is now kind of disenfranchising African-American community in my eyes. So I think, my recommendation would be to split up Ward 6, particularly around Bay Ridge Gardens. I recommended putting in Ward 7 and Robinwood in Ward 5, so that it would be, economically diverse wards, not just pertaining to, the African-American community, particularly because I feel that Ward 6 does have a large African-American community, but it's a very large low-income African-American community. And they don't get much representation, for example, in Robinwood, into the surrounding environment around them, businesses and everything. They don't get that representation. So that's kind of is my recommendation. And then just kind of pertain, like, I don't know if this is something that this group can look at, but just the legacy that the African American population has dwindled, over time. And I don't know if redistricting has played a part in that over the years of being a city. So I know it's not something that just happened recently, but I just think that may there may be, some correlations between redistricting and the dwindling population of African Americans in the city. So, but that's all I really just shared. And I'm here for any questions.
Thank you. I appreciate you staying on for some questions. And thank you for your input. I certainly value it. Anyone on the committee have some questions for Mr. Ajayi? I got it closer to correct that time. I have some questions. So in my reading of the materials from 2011, it looked like former Alderwoman Julia Stankovic and former Alderwoman Classy Hoyle both were recommending that the public housing get divided into so that each ward has some public housing. And then there was a different perspective. I think Mr. Snowden appeared to be the most vocal person offering the contrary view, that if you spread out the public housing, you'll do two things. One, that'll be the minority group in each of those wards. So like Robinwood into Ward 5, for instance, would get less attention because it would be the majority, and you would lose the majority representatives in those wards. So they heard those two perspectives and ultimately decided not to make a change. What's your reaction to hearing that perspective?
Because, like I said, because public housing, really the stock is dwindling and they're becoming public-private partnerships where it's going to be more of subsidized. I just think that it actually would help the neighbors actually work together, because, for example, I think like Robinwood, Annapolis Overlook is right next to it, and it's in a different ward, I believe. So you could want to work together, but you don't have to. And the alderperson definitely doesn't have to deal with issues between those two communities. So I just think it would help with better relations between neighbors if split up the public housing, in my opinion.
I have a couple of questions. Did you ask the resident council boards their opinion on this before you presented it to us?
No.
I think you need to have a conversation with him, because what you will do with that collective vote is possibly dilute it so much that it won't exist anymore. You might want to present that to those resident councils. I'd strongly suggest that.
Okay.
I have a comment.
We'd also like to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I interrupting?
Go ahead, Marianne.
This was the main reason that I wanted to serve on this task force, is because when I looked at the ward maps and I looked at some of the artificial boundaries that were drawn in Ward 6 in particular, it struck me because there is literally one road, Tyler Avenue, that connects Robinwood with the rest of the ward. And it's divided by Forest Drive. Well, excuse me, that's got to be one of the biggest boundaries in the world. And as Adetola said, right next door is Annapolis Overlook. On the other side is a completely different community. One of the things that strikes me is that Ward 6, Ward 3, Ward 4 all have African-American council people. So the argument to me, and again, I can certainly be educated, but the argument that the minority representation isn't there, it doesn't 100% hold up. I understand that there's strong feelings, but we all know it takes 5 votes to pass the legislation. And right now, the representation on the on the council with the low-income communities is one vote. So tell me how that helps representation and interest of communities move forward. And I'm not thinking that this is where we're going to solve all this, but I think it's something moving forward that we really need to look at. How our inclusivity is really important. And if you carve out communities based on income and color, that's not inclusive. And that doesn't foster the kind of neighborhood interaction, collegiality, and just living together that I think it is we want to do. And that's all I have to say.
I would like,
Thank you, Ms. Smith.
I would like to know if there's some way that we can educate ourselves. Say, I don't know if there's someone at the University of Maryland or some that studies these voting districts and how things work. I feel like I could, or tell me where I can go and be more educated on the different dynamics that we are talking about.
Tola, do you have a response to that?
I would just say from my research, I've seen a lot of studies about kind of like redlining, gerrymandering from a state perspective, or particularly Baltimore City, but I've never really seen anybody kind of do research about Annapolis, just my view.
I wonder if Dan Natif is the professor at Anne Arundel Community College, who often talks about our voting patterns. I wonder if he has studied this issue. Do you know, has anyone talked to Dan about these issues by chance?
No.
I'll reach out to him.
Yeah, and I would
okay.
just say this. When Judge Jarrasco was giving his presentation, and he quoted the Jingle factor test, the 1965 dilution of a minority community, I think that's pretty much the way the commissioner task force looked at Ward 6 the last time. Whether is it still applicable this time? I don't know. But I think that would be a question for those communities. Would they feel that they would be served better if they were broken up, as opposed to staying within the boundaries that they already have?
It certainly seemed like the last commission on the issue decided that was not the case, that they would be better served in one voting block.
Yes.
I think there were a couple other hands raised. I think we might, excuse me, might have lost a couple. Oh, there, Harold, did you have your hand raised before or still?
No, she just said what I was going to say about the Jingles factor.
Okay, thank you. And I thought I saw another hand up, the figurative chat, but I don't see one now. Oh.
It was me.
Yes, Laura.
So I was just going to say that maybe calling the NAACP and CASA. They have policy directors and advocates who can really speak to this, to redistricting. I was listening to the CASA guy, Ashanti, and he's really amazing, and he could bring a lot of perspective that I think could be interesting for this group. And also, I read a publication by the NAACP, the Asian American Justice Center, and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and I'm happy to share that with you guys as well, if that's helpful.
Thank you. I would like to add more explicitly, and Laura, you mentioned it, but we now have the benefit of having these two liaisons, which 10 years ago they did not. So my understanding, when they had a public hearing, the first public hearing was very lightly attended. I think there was one person there. And then they had more people speak at the ending public hearing. I think this committee could really benefit from the two of you helping us do outreach to your communities. I don't know if that's an appropriate phrase, but the communities that you're liaisons to, helping ensure that they understand the issues that are on the table and being discussed, and offer us their perspectives and testimony and opinions. And they could do that at the public hearing itself, or by email or written testimony. So my request is to help us reach your communities and get their input.
Definitely.
You don't
Yeah.
have these dates. I was just going to say, by the end of this call, we should have the dates firmed up for the public hearing. So I'll ask Hillary to just confirm the dates and location and mechanics of the public hearing. Sean, you had something to add?
When I did this during the last redistricting, I can't remember who had me reach out, if it was the state or someone within the city. I did run my numbers by the ACLU. I can look to see if you're interested, if I have a contact. Granted, it's been 10 years, but they did come back with a favorable recommendation based on what we had put together.
Absolutely. I'm looking for as much input as possible. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions for our two liaisons before we move on to the next piece of business? All right. Again, thank you so much. You're welcome to stay on the call, but we certainly understand if you had other things to do, and we'll follow up with you.
Thank you. Any way we can help, let me know. I'll put my information in the chat. Thank you. Have a good
day. Thank you.
We don't
our next
have chat on here,
is hearing
so
from, I'm sorry?
apologies. We don't have chat in this venue, so I'll share Tola and Laura's contact information for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Our next business is to have a demonstration of the census tool by Sean, and got a little behind schedule, but I think it was certainly worthwhile having the discussion that we had, and we're not so far off. But I just wanted to report in where we are on the agenda. Sean, if you'd like to take it away and show us what you have for us. Please.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. Is it coming through?
It is.
Okay. I want to go through a few things with you guys today. I am in the process of creating each of you an account on arcgis.com. I didn't send it out yet because I didn't want you to get it, think it was junk, and delete it. So I'll get that to you in the next day or so. This is the platform I'm planning to use for redistricting. And it also allows me to provide you with interactive maps that you can make adjustments and look at things yourselves if you would like. This tool here is a paid redistricting tool that I'm currently evaluating. I haven't decided if this is definitely the one that I'm going with, but so far I'm pretty happy with it. And what they have done, they have added the state data, the adjusted that we are required to use by law. So this has the correct adjusted data for the incarcerated people that we had to be moved out or in. This boundary differs from the legal one that we use. The census apparently does not know that these areas outside the academy are part of the city. Luckily, they are zero population, so it doesn't affect what we're trying to do, but the city boundary does in fact go around. In your map, when you get it, your logins, you will see that our boundaries differ from that. And so just please keep that in mind. So the representation that you're seeing here is me taking our existing wards and kind of putting the lines, because the blocks have changed, as close as I can. So if I zoom up here, this area, you can see Ward 2 actually comes down Admiral. The block has changed. So I had to pick one ward or another to put the whole block in. So if I go here and let's say we decide, no, we want that to be Ward 3, if you take a look here at this number for your districts, when I start to click, or I'm sorry, we want it for Ward 2, you'll see they change. So this is kind of the process we'll use to reassign everything. So after and I'm just kind of giving you guys some ideas of tools. I want to see what works, what doesn't. We can change how we operate. But one of the things that I'm going to provide when you get your login is this interactive map. And with this, I've taken the map that I've created here and put it in an application that you can kind of look around and kind of zoom in, get a better idea where those population numbers are for each of the blocks. I also did put our current wards so that, again, you can get an idea of how the configurations currently are. And also when you click on each of the blocks, it's going to give you the breakdown. Now, one thing I had been working on prior to our meetings was taking the census data and trying to provide it in a way that is a little more understandable to the public. So I thought this might also help the task force with a breakdown of what census data is. So give you some definitions of how the data is determined, how the blocks changed. And then also some dashboards that kind of break down how the populations have changed between 2010 and 2020. And again, those things are interactive. You can zoom in and out, take a closer look at areas. And then this one is the racial and Hispanic breakdown. And this is interactive by ward. So you can click on a ward and get the different demographics.
Sean, is it possible to see within Ward 3, for instance, from the maps, where the different ethnic groups are living?
Let me see here. What we could do is by doing the blocks, and I was starting to play with this some, we could do charts so that when you clicked on a block, it would show you a chart of the racial makeup. I kind of, I've been toying with that because I'm not sure the best way to show it and make the information usable. The other thing that this tool does is, let me see. I think I already ran it. There's still some reports that I'm evaluating, but it does give you a nice, oh, here it is, a population summary. We might be able to break that down further. But do you think providing a graph that popped up with that block that showed a graph, you know, the breakdown, or how do you think would be best to show the information?
I'm envisioning it like for the ward map where you show Ward 3, I think happened to be orange, that within that orange color, you could have an overlay of either hash mark or crosswise to show the different ethnic populations in some way.
By the block?
Ideally, we'd be able to see here on this map, as you get, like, zoom in a little bit and you're looking at Ward 3, and I guess it was yellow, not orange. You'd be able to see where in Ward 3, in a general sense, so like kind of maybe either shading or marking circles or triangles, whatever it is, where the different ethnic groups are. So if you were trying to move around some different communities to be matched up with other like communities, you'd be able to spot where those communities are to do that. So we were talking about doing that anecdotally from Laura.
So maybe make the symbol change by each race. Have a different layer for each race.
Right.
Yeah, I can play around with that.
Yeah, I think that would be incredibly helpful, because if we're looking at how we're going to be aware of the population concentrations, if we knew that the majority of a certain group in Ward 3 live close to the boundary of whatever the next ward is, that would help us out a great deal, because we could compare the two wards, and Ward 3 and Ward 4, for instance, and look at where that equitable distribution or that concentration of groups would be. Jared, I think that's an excellent idea if it's possible.
The only thing that I'm not sure with what I'm envisioning you would be able to do well is, say you wanted to compare Asian and white. That if you start to combine two, you know, I don't know how the symbology would really, I don't know if that would work. I can, like I said, I can play with it. It works very well if you're looking at one.
Maybe if you just highlight African Americans and highlight Hispanics.
Okay.
And then you could assume what's left is majority white.
Yeah, I can prepare some options and then have the task force tell me what works best.
Thank you. I apologize for interrupting your presentation. So if you weren't done, please feel free to continue.
No, I was just about done. I was planning on sending Hillary the summary document so everyone would have the links in one spot. And unfortunately, this application here, I only have one license. It's not something I can send around, but I can certainly give you access to the interactive map so that you can start to look at the numbers and, you know, kind of make some assessments.
Right. So one of our jobs is going to be sharing information with the community. And so I was envisioning having a web page on the city's website where we can share information about where the public hearings are, what our schedule is. This is already, I meant to say, very informative and useful. I don't know, what is your recommendation between whether we have Ina give us a web page and link to the work here, or we intrude on the web page that you have already designed and add in our public hearing schedule and our meeting schedule in general?
Well, I'm a big believer in doing both. I think having some presence on the city's website, as well as I have a product called ArcGIS Hub, which allows people to actually join so that when there is new content, they're notified by email. You can do schedules and different things like that on it, but I do think the traditional posting of things on the city website is also very important, because that is where people go, a lot of people, for that information. But then you can link to things like the story map, or we can make this map public. Well, I don't know about making this one public because I don't like sharing data down to the block level. It's not a best practice. by the census. It is public data, but they recommend that you not share it at this level. But that's why I was giving each of you logins.
Hillary,
But certainly
I think you had your
any
hand up.
plans.
Yeah, so we do have the story map, I believe, already on the website. I'll create a page in the boards and commissions section for your board, and then we'll link to any of the tools or products that Sean posts in the GIS part of the website.
Very good. Thank you. Mary Ann?
Yes. This thought just occurred to me that I don't know if we are including the residents, the plebes and whoever at the Naval Academy and the students at St. John's when we're considering the populations of the city, since they're not permanent residents. And I wonder, is there someone who can answer that?
I can answer about the academy because it is not part of the city.
Okay.
It is considered based on the meets and bounds outside. St. John's, it does look like there is a large number of people, so I would assume that it looks like at least some were counted there.
I think what we heard at the last meeting was that that population counted as far as how many people are in the ward, but they don't vote, so it's a consideration we can factor in. They don't vote in our elections because they're not residents.
And some St. John students may be residents, Naval Academy or not. A student, I believe, can register to vote in their home with their parents or at their place where they live for college. So some of them may actually be voters.
Right.
Yeah, I would like to get that clarified because I think that goes back to that issue that was brought up at the very beginning of the meeting about eligible voters versus people who actually live here, total population.
Just to clarify, a student at St. John's is inside city limits. A student at the Naval Academy is outside of city limits. So they would not be counted. It's up to the census whether to count the students, but we have to consider them residents regardless of voter status.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Any other questions for Sean? Okay. Sean, thank you so much for the presentation. We'll all keep an eye out for your invitation. And I would suggest to everybody, if we can, make some time to look at that before the next meeting. The next meeting, again, we'll talk about the schedule in a minute, is a public hearing. So I'm not suggesting that we need to have maps ready, but I think we should have some understanding of the system and how it works before we start hearing what people have to say about it. Because I imagine most people will not be very well informed about these details. They won't be spending the time on it like we are. We'll just having that context will be helpful. Anything else before we move on with Sean? All right. Sean, thank you so much for your time. You're certainly welcome to continue on the call with us, but we understand if you had other places you wanted to be.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Our next guest is Eric Lashinsky for a discussion of current development.
Okay, Sean, I think you need to unshare your screen. You can pull up my.
Thank you. You beat me to it.
All right, here we go. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good to be with you. I'll try to make this quick since I know we're running out of time. I tried to put together an objective, agnostic rundown of the kind of residential development we've seen over the last 10 years. I'm not typically doing things as objectively, but because we are in my role, I'm the long range planner for the city. I'm kind of looking at where we want to go as a city, and but this helps to kind of understand where we've been, and I hope this gives you a perspective on the kind of residential development we've seen over the last 10 years that should kind of align with where the population changes are. So what we did is we mapped the final residential permits, which means the projects that have been closed out where there's a certificate of occupancy, and you can disregard the fact that we broke out 2010 to 2019 and 2020. Those are all the same symbols. The yellow star is single family development, essentially townhomes or detached houses. And then the orange, very few orange, but that's multifamily, meaning apartments essentially. And then you have all the wards here. Kind of zooming in to the southern portion of the city, I'm going to go through each of these very quickly, just to have a page on each, just to show you what they are. And we can share this presentation so you can go over it later on your own time. But, there's concentrations of new development in Ward 1 and Ward 8, but it's scattered in every ward. So there's some repetition on this slide from the previous slide, but we wanted to capture Ward 2 and 3, and so the basic takeaways here in terms of new residential development, it did happen in each ward. Largest concentrations in Ward 1 and Ward 8, as I said. It's primarily high-end residential and townhomes. Very little multifamily housing in comparison to single-family attached and detached. And then, it's important to acknowledge what's not accounted here. I just want to be clear. There was a lot of redeveloped affordable housing by the Housing Authority of the City of Annapolis, HACA, but it was primarily one for one, meaning there was not an increase in new units. Now, this is one exception. This image here is of Oberry Court, where there was a net increase of 20 units. But there was a significant amount of redevelopment in a number of their communities. So I'm just going to kind of go through ward by ward here, give you a picture of what these developments look like. This is in Ward 1 downtown on Franklin Street. This is a redevelopment of an existing building. I think it may have been an office structure previously. And I should say, I only looked at new residential development over 8 units. There are pockets of, 1 to 6 units in some places of the city, but I just wanted to give you a summary of the larger developments. So these are apartments in this structure. Another apartment building, kind of adaptive reuse of an older building. This is the old rec center, which is now 8 units planned. 7 are complete. So that there's 7 in this building, and then there's 1 that the developer is trying to build next door that is not complete yet. It hasn't even started construction or have a permit, but so for all intents and purposes, there's 7 new units here. And I should say, if you're trying to figure out population based on these developments, our average household size is about 2.4. It has changed very little since 2010. We just use demographic numbers that we get to come up with that, and so you can kind of multiply out by the number of units. It's a imperfect science because we all know that the household numbers will vary pretty significantly based on the type of housing and its location. But that's one way of trying to come to a number. Uptown at Murray Hill is a townhome community on West Street. That's 30 units, and you can see it here. It also included some single family homes on Southgate, and I'm not sure, I forget what the street is here, but so it was a combination of different types of units. Another development nearby is called West End Row, large townhomes, 18 units in a row. They're all attached. Well, there's some on the back side and some on the front, so kind of two rows. This development is near Maryland Hall and Bates Middle School. Its entrance is on Spa Road. It's called Spa Gate. 19 townhomes. You see them here. What you're looking at in these small blow-up maps are the parcel lines for the new units. Ward 2, Oberry Court is one of these larger housing authority redevelopments that yielded 20 net new units. 10 of those were actually Habitat for Humanity projects right here. But the majority of the development are these larger blocks, which are a combination of townhomes and apartments. This project I should have added is under construction. I mean, it's nearly complete, but this is in Ward 3. This is 42 units, apartments off of West Street near Gibraltar. You can see it doesn't have the updated base from the aerial imagery, but if you were to go by there today, you'd see most of this is complete. It's next to the Monarch Academy, the former Capital Gazette newspaper building. The Towns at Neal Farm is also in Ward 3, but it's close to Old Solomon's Island Road, which is right here. It's right where Old Solomon's meets Route 2. This was a property that was annexed into the city, and it looks like apartments, but these are actually large 4-story townhomes. There are 42 units in this development, and this is, I believe, is complete at this point, although it doesn't show that to be the case in this aerial, but you can see all of the lot lines. The Village Greens is probably the largest development in the last 10 years in terms of number of units. It's off of Forest Drive. You might know it from the retail development that is in front of it, where the Walgreens or CVS and gas station restaurants, and behind that is the development. And it's primarily attached homes, but some of them are live work, which is interesting. We don't see enough of that in the city. Tried to keep my comments objective, but yeah, it's hard. The Enclave on Spa Road, just very near, close to Hilltop Lane. It's this kind of configuration, all townhomes, 36 units in Ward 5. Also in Ward 5 is Primrose Hill, which is across from Truxton Park on Hilltop Lane. It's kind of tucked back, so you don't see it. Don't see much of it from Hilltop Lane, but it's mostly townhomes with a few detached houses. In Ward 6, Boucher Place is near the corner of President Street and Boucher, and it's a combination of townhomes and detached houses, 30 units. Thomas Woods, also in Ward 6, but on the Forest Drive side of Ward 6. This is under construction right now, so I'm just showing it. I didn't have an image of what it will look like, but this is the site plan. And these are the parcel lines for this 10 units, townhomes. The institutional numbers, you were talking about colleges before, and this is it's important to acknowledge, the growing demographics in the city are also heavy on senior population. That's actually the fastest growing demographic in the city outside of, not speaking racially, but from an age perspective, it's about a 35% increase over the last 10 years. And so this assisted living facility near Edgewood Road and Bay Ridge Road, or Forest Drive becomes Bay Ridge Road, by the giant shopping center there is actually has a phase 2 that is not yet permitted. So I don't think you should be including it, but it's next door, and it would be an independent living facility. And there are a few other assisted living projects kind of in the pipeline, but I think it's
Eric, do you know where Parkside Preserve, what ward that will be in, or is it?
So that's the next one here. That's Ward 7. It's also on Forest Drive and under construction. So I should, this actually is the largest of, the ones I'm presenting tonight in terms of units. I should say these in the lower right, these units, that was part of a conservation easement that is no longer part of the development. So it's really just kind of this L shape configuration. So this is, you could drive by this today and see a lot of construction happening. So this is a pretty significant one to be considering as far as projects under construction that will change the population counts. Sailor's Way, or sometimes called Sailor's Quay, depends who you ask, is on Bay Ridge Avenue near the Bay Ridge Shopping Center. It's just it's 15 new units kind of tucked in, pretty sort of light density, but it's a nice, configuration. Mostly detached houses. And then 2 more in Ward 8. Sail Lofts is kind of a mixed, technically it's kind of a mixed use development. There's some office space on the ground floor around the corner on 4th Street here, but it's 10 apartment units total. And then finally the South Annapolis Yacht Center is 11 units split between detached homes and apartments, and it's at the corner of Boucher and State Street, I believe, or Washington, in Ward 8. So that's the very quick rundown. Again, I'll share this with you so you can kind of look at each development closer and go by them if you want to get a better look. But that was just kind of a quick summary. So
thank you for that presentation. Anyone on the task force have any questions for Eric?
I do.
Friend Marianne?
And my question is, how much consideration do we give to permitted but not occupied construction? Because we have to go by census figures, and we know that Parkside Preserve and SAAC and all those are going to be adding to the population numbers, but that's not a done deal. That's future projections. So how much do we take that into consideration when we're looking at these ward configurations?
My understanding is to the extent that we have the total numbers of population, it won't include any of these projections. But to the extent, and so that's the number when we calculate what the average is for each home, those numbers will not be impacted by the future projections. But what that we can consider these projected occupations in the distribution that we make. And in 10 years ago, that's what they did and that's why Crystal Spring properties switched from Ward 5 to Ward 4. It didn't help the then numbers, but they anticipated in the 10 years that Crystal Spring would have been built and supplement the lower population that Ward 4 had compared to everybody else. Obviously, 10 years wasn't enough time for that projection.
Yeah, it's nothing happens very fast in the city, and sort of measure change in decades, it seems. But so it is a tricky predicament to use anything that really hasn't started construction. I mean, I think that's kind of, I spoke with Sean and Hillary a little bit about this, and I included Parkside Preserve and Thomas Woods only because they're under construction right now, although the housing units are not built yet. They're sort of in process, and anything else that has an approved permit but hasn't broken ground, there's a variety of reasons why that project may not happen in the future. There's several projects, I should say, that are permitted and have not started construction, and I don't know when that will happen. And what I can share, in our department, we publish every month a list of active projects that are in some stage of permitting, and that might be helpful for folks to see kind of the range of projects that are sort of active but perhaps stalled in some cases. One example is a project that you might be familiar with it was called Central Park, I believe. It was on the corner of Hilltop and near Primrose Road. It was going to be, I don't know, maybe 45 townhomes. It was completely permitted, approved. It passed all the forest conservation ordinance, all the requirements, and then the owner developer just basically decided to pull the plug on it. And and that was after probably several years of planning and design. And so it's really hard to crystal ball, what's going to happen in the city.
Right. Eric, maybe just for our information purposes, we know the numbers are based on the real occupations, current occupations, but maybe just for our information, you can give us a best guess for the properties by ward that will be occupied by the next election, 2025. And maybe you could do sort of not high confidence list, how many new residences will be added to each ward, then maybe a second middle confidence, and then a low confidence between now and the next election. And it won't be something that we could hold anyone to. It'll just be a guess, but I don't know what it will say, so I don't know how useful it will be. But It might be useful to at least see it, so then we can evaluate for ourselves whether we find it helpful. And I don't think we particularly care about looking at Ward 1, whether it's the Eastport Sales Loft or Sailor Way. I know those are done developments, but we're just looking for a total in Ward 1. How many new residents are you anticipating by the next election? Ward 2, how many? And 3.
Yeah.
Anyone want to modify that request, or does that sound helpful? Thank you. Any other questions for Eric? Okay. Thank you for your time, Eric. I have a high degree of confidence that we'll be in touch with further questions as we go along.
Okay. Happy to be
we'll
of
certainly,
service.
I don't think we have time today, but maybe for the public hearing, my suggestion is that you do, other than I can do introductions, but before we ask for the public hearing, if you can plan and maybe this is more for Sean, and maybe you, me, and Hillary can talk offline afterwards, but I want to have a 10-minute presentation about what we're showing the residents before they are then given a chance to speak. But I want to keep it real short and tight, so no more than 10 minutes. So maybe like I said, Eric and Sean, Hillary and we can talk afterwards of how we can put together that real brief. I like a public hearing to be for the public, but I also like to use the opportunity to educate.
Gotcha.
Our next business, I'm sorry, we're already over at 6:40. You'll all be patient with me to give me until 5 minutes. Just want to get the meeting dates approved. Did everyone that's on the call get the proposed meeting dates that I sent around last night with some detail about what I hope to accomplish? Hillary, that's the older version. That's not what I sent yesterday.
Sorry, hold on.
Okay, thanks. I'll just talk it through while Hillary's doing it. So our next meeting would be December 21st, and the proposal is to have at 7 p.m. an in-person meeting. The location has not been determined, although I'm partial to the Pitmore Rec Center because they have good space and it's fairly central and they have transportation, I believe.
And parking.
That's my vote. If Hillary, I'm sorry, and parking, right, and parking. So is the committee okay with that, with tasking Hillary on reserving that space at Pitmore? Okay. That's at 7 p.m. Like I said, I would like to start with no more than 15 minutes at most, but preferably 10 minutes of an introduction about I'll say a few words about what our mission is, and then turn it over to Sean or Eric to present visually a shortened version of what they did today, and then take public comment. I think I sent it in that same email a long list of things that we should be thinking about for a public hearing. I'll quickly go through. Having an online website, identifying the public hearing dates, times, locations, and access. Agreeing to accept written testimony via email or in paper form, and what those instructions are to how to submit that. Preparing a press release in advance with a 2 weeks notice at least, and then a 1 week follow-up, a reminder, and then using our liaisons to reach out as well. Using Facebook, Twitter, print, and electronic media, the Capitol, Annapolis, Naptown Scoop, and Annapolis Patch, reaching out to the HOAs, the ward associations, particularly like WARA and ECA, the minority representation organizations like the Caucus of African American Leaders, as well as the voting-centric organizations like League of Women Voters and League of Conservation Voters.
You might want to add the HACA has resident councils. They should also be notified.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Okay. Part of the access, identifying the recipient for public testimony, who they send it to, and then working with that person, assuming it's probably Hillary, of sharing it with the committee. And then the point added during this call is making sure we have some of these materials at least available in Spanish and then shared via text. Laura G seems to have a program for that. So that's a lot to get done in a short amount of time. Hillary, do we think we can meet those goals by a December 21st here, meeting?
Sorry, I was making sure I wasn't muted. Yes, I can do that.
Okay, thank you. And so I have request to Hillary to have an announcement go out by December 1st, and also the alderperson and local elected officials. And then a reminder sent December 14th. After that, my next proposed meeting is another regular scheduled meeting on January 18th, where we would meet, discuss the input that we got, and hopefully by then we've all had a chance to meet with Sean and develop some proposed maps. and we could hopefully have a good work session there. Then we meet roughly 2 weeks later to evaluate those plans and start discussing, or hopefully working towards a consensus about what this committee will recommend. And then we'll have offered 2 weeks later another public hearing, but this time we're giving them options. So the thinking is, first we're sharing what the problem is to be solved, and then we're getting their input on how we solve it. Then the next public hearing is, okay, here's our proposed solution, or at least maybe it's not one proposal, maybe it's 1, 2, or 3, or 4. And then we meet, let's see, that's on February 15th. And then we have not a meeting deadline, but a March 10th deadline to receive public testimony. And that's before one of our final meetings on March 15th, where hopefully by then we've had a chance to continue our debate, hear public testimony, and we have a healthy debate and work session and hopefully vote on the 15th. We then hand it over to law office to do the very tedious job of creating legislation. And then we meet finally to approve that proposed legislation to go to council. Anybody have suggestions, changes, questions? Okay. Laura, yes?
Hi, sorry. I had a question about, I know you had mentioned that we could help community members to submit written testimony. Is there a template that you guys could provide or something for that of how it's supposed to be formatted? And we can definitely work on that. And would it be okay if it's submitted in Spanish as well?
So
Question.
Laura,
Hillary, I hope you can answer.
Yes, I can set up a comments page, the same that we have for all boards and commissions and the council. There is a format to submit comments. And those get emailed to the chair and the liaison, but I can include you as well. And that way, if any comments come in Spanish, if you could assist us in translating,
Sure.
That would be great.
Before I ask for a vote for this, I'd like to make a note, Hillary, wherever I mistakenly write commission, please change that to task force.
Okay.
See that in line H, at least the Tuesday, March 15th.
Okay.
So with that change incorporated, can I get a motion to approve the proposed meeting dates?
Oh, moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you, Marianne. Can I get a second? Thank you.
Second.
All those in favor, raise your hand, please. Oh, yeah, okay. I should have asked first, was there any discussion, but I didn't gather there was. Any opposed? Okay, none opposed. Thank you. All right, so we have our official meeting plans. Thank you so much for everyone's time today. I apologize for going over. We'll be better organized for the next meeting, which will be a public hearing. We have a lot of work to do in terms of getting ready for that public hearing, putting together the quick 10-minute presentation, doing a lot of outreach, and each of us gaining some familiarity with Sean's program and maybe start playing around. And then we also had some requests of Sean to add in the ethnic composition of blocks if possible. And Laura was going to reach out to some other organizations like the ACLU, I believe. And I think, Laura, you offered to reach out to NAACP. Wasn't positive about that note. But
Juan had said
I'm sure we will
about ACLU. I had said NAACP and CASA.
Okay, perfect. I know the last commission, the commission 10 years ago dealt with that question of whether to keep public housing together in wards or divide it, and it sounds like we're going to have that question again today. So it'd be good to have the input of those who feel strongly about it. I think there are a lot of people who do. Anything else before we adjourn? Thank you so much for your attention to these issues and participation. It's going to be a group effort if we're successful. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I don't know that we need since we're not a